Some wounds aren't visible, they wait quietly for the right moment to surface. Harrison Ford had spent decades flying both on screen and in the skies, never knowing that one boy's disappointment had followed him into adulthood. But on a flight from Los Angeles to Tokyo, a captain stepped out of the cockpit and spoke 12 words that froze the cabin. Words that would take them both back to a winter night long ago and to a chance neither of them saw coming. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. The cabin of first class was a world apart, bathed in the warm glow of overhead lights that softened every edge. Outside the oval windows, the sky was giving its last performance of the day, streaked with ribbons of gold and orange that bled into the darker blues above the Pacific. The low, steady hum of the engines was like a heartbeat under the quiet, a rhythm that promised hours of smooth travel ahead. Passengers spoke in murmurs, their words folding into the hush, the sound of crystal glasses meeting their coasters, the occasional rustle of a newspaper being turned. Harrison Ford sat in the second row, near the window, his seat angled just enough to catch the dying light. The brown leather jacket he wore looked lived in, creased at the elbows in the way only years of wear can shape. And on his lap lay a book whose edges had softened from use, stick and rudder, the classic manual on the art of flying. He read it without hurry, one hand turning the pages, the other resting lightly on the armrest, fingers tapping a slow, absent rhythm. Every so often he looked up, eyes moving past the glass to the sky, as if measuring the altitude in his mind out of habit. Ford was no stranger to the air. Beyond the movie sets, beyond the cameras and interviews, there was the man who had flown his own planes into remote stretches of wilderness to pull strangers out of trouble, who had landed on rough strips where no control tower guided him. He had been in cockpits when the air turned thin and the light dimmed in ways that made a person measure their choices with precision. But this evening, he was here not as a pilot, not as a rescuer, not as the man whose face had been on posters for decades. He was simply a passenger, strapped into 2A, surrounded by the muted luxury of first class. The air carried a trace of polished wood and brewed coffee, the faintest echo of something floral from the galley. A businessman 2 seats ahead adjusted his tie and scrolled through emails. Across the aisle, a woman in a navy skirt suit flipped through the pages of an international fashion magazine, the gloss catching the light. Harrison turned another page in his book, the words about lift and drag as familiar to him as the scripts he'd memorized in another life. He reached for his glass of water, condensation cool against his hand, took a measured sip, then set it back on the coaster with the care of a man who knew the small things mattered. There was no rush here, no camera flashes, no voices calling his name, just the quiet symphony of travel at altitude. Outside, the horizon deepened, the orange slipping toward red, then violet, each shade reflected in the curved glass beside him. He allowed himself the smallest breath of satisfaction. For once, he was not the one guiding the craft, not the one making the call when weather shifted or an engine coughed. For once, he could let go and let someone else take the controls. He thought briefly of the times he had been in the left seat, eyes on the gauges, listening to the hum change as he brought a plane down through cloud into a clearing just big enough to land. Those moments had their own kind of peace, but they were earned through tension. Tonight's peace was different. It was the kind you stumbled into and hoped would last. Somewhere behind him, a faint laugh bubbled up from a pair of travelers clinking champagne flutes, and he glanced once toward the sound before returning to his book. The sky outside was already shifting again, and for a moment it felt like the whole flight might pass like this, uninterrupted, unremarkable, untouched by anything beyond the cabin walls. He didn't yet know how quickly that feeling would change. The announcement came without warning, a soft chime followed by the voice of a flight attendant that was polite enough, but carried an edge too fine to miss. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be experiencing a short delay before departure. Thank you for your patience." The words floated over the cabin speakers, but something in the way she paused on patience made Harrison look up from his book. He placed stick and rudder on the armrest, one finger keeping his place, and glanced toward the galley. Through the narrow gap in the curtain, he caught sight of 2 crew members standing close, heads tilted together in a quiet urgency. The younger of the 2, a flight attendant with her hair neatly pulled back, cast a quick glance toward his seat before leaning to whisper to the first officer. Her lips moved just enough for him to catch the shape of a few words. He couldn't be sure, but it looked like she had said, "That's him." The curtain swayed as someone moved behind it. A moment later, the sound of the cockpit door unlatching broke the soft hum of the cabin. Passengers turned instinctively, some out of habit, others sensing that whatever was about to happen wasn't routine. The captain emerged, tall, his posture carrying the kind of rigidity that came from years in uniform. His cap sat squarely on his head, the brim shadowing eyes that scanned the length of first class with the precision of someone accustomed to making assessments quickly. He didn't rush. Each step forward was measured, the soles of his shoes making the faintest contact with the carpet. Conversations thinned into silence. The captain's gaze moved from row to row, noting faces without lingering, until it found Harrison Ford. There was no flicker of recognition softening the look, no warmth, just a direct, unwavering focus. He stopped halfway down the aisle, the stillness in his stance sharper than movement. When he spoke, his voice was steady, clear enough to carry to every seat in the cabin without the need for the intercom. "This flight will not depart," he said, "until that man leaves the aircraft." The words landed with a weight that seemed to shift the air. It took a heartbeat for them to settle, and then a ripple moved through the rows, a quick exchange of glances, the faint buzz of whispers. Someone reached for their phone, tilting it just low enough to record without drawing attention. In the row ahead, a businessman's brow lifted as he leaned toward his companion. Across the aisle, a woman straightened in her seat, eyes darting between the captain and Ford. Harrison didn't move. He sat back slightly, one hand resting on the armrest, the other still touching the book beside him. His expression was unreadable, though the set of his jaw was calm, not defensive. Outside, the last streaks of orange light were fading toward a muted violet, shadows gathering along the curve of the wing. Inside, the warmth of the cabin lights felt suddenly cooler. The captain's voice cut through again, unsoftened by the pause. "I don't want you on my plane." The sentence hung there, a declaration and a challenge in equal measure. Somewhere near the galley, a flight attendant shifted her weight, as if considering whether to step in, then thought better of it. Harrison's eyes stayed on the man in front of him, steady, patient. He had been in enough tense moments to know that the first thing you give away in a confrontation is the pace. And he wasn't about to let anyone else set his. For the rest of the passengers, the sense of ease that had filled the cabin minutes ago was gone, replaced by the taut, silent pull of curiosity and something close to disbelief. Whatever this was, it wasn't a security issue or a matter of procedure. It was personal, and it was just beginning. The cabin had gone utterly still, the kind of silence that feels heavier than noise. A few phones hovered just above tray tables, their lenses tilted discreetly toward the aisle, small red recording lights winking in the dim. The soft yellow of the reading lamps cast angled shadows across faces, cutting the space into pockets of light and shade. As if the scene had been staged for a confrontation no one had rehearsed. Harrison Ford reached up and removed the thin-framed reading glasses he had been wearing, folding them with deliberate care and setting them on the closed book beside him. His eyes, now unobstructed, fixed on the man standing a few paces away. "Any particular reason, Captain?" His voice was steady, low enough to draw the rest of the room forward in their seats, as if leaning in to catch it. The captain's jaw tightened before he answered. "After what you've done before. I don't want you on my plane." The statement landed flat and sharp at once, without context, leaving it hanging in the air like a note that refused to resolve. A stir moved through the cabin, barely audible, the scrape of a shoe, the shift of fabric, a breath taken and held. Harrison's gaze didn't waver, but it moved briefly around the room, scanning the faces turned toward him. A woman in the aisle seat across from him had her lips pressed together, her eyes darting between the two men. 3 rows back, a younger man held his phone at chest level, pretending to check messages but not blinking. Ford's eyes came back to the captain, and he settled deeper into his seat, his hands resting loosely on the armrests. He didn't speak again, didn't push. The choice to stay silent was its own kind of move, one that shifted the weight of the moment back toward the man standing. The captain's fingers flexed at his sides, then stilled. He seemed to be waiting for an outburst, for a denial, for something he could counter, but none came. The air between them thickened with the unsaid, and the longer it stretched, the more it pressed on the edges of the room. Outside the window, the tarmac lights blurred slightly against the deepening violet of the sky, halos of brightness in the gathering dark. Inside, the atmosphere had condensed into a single line drawn down the center of the aisle. Passengers weren't just looking now, they were listening for the next thing, for the drop that would explain the charge in the air. Harrison's stillness was not passivity. It was a kind of quiet pressure, the sort that makes the other person carry their own accusation until it's too heavy to hold. A flight attendant near the galley shifted her stance, her eyes flicking to the captain as if to gauge whether he needed a way out or a way forward. He didn't take his eyes off Ford. "You know exactly why," he said finally, though there was a flicker in his tone, something less certain than the words themselves. Harrison didn't bite. He simply raised one eyebrow, almost imperceptibly, the way a man does when he's inviting the truth to step into the open. The captain's breath came a fraction deeper, his shoulders tightening under the weight of eyes on him. For the rest of the cabin, time felt slowed to the space between one breath and the next, a collective pause before something inevitable. Whatever the reason was, it was no longer just between them. The moment had been claimed by everyone watching, and it was only a matter of time before it came into the light. "It was winter," the captain began, his voice flattening the space between them into a narrow corridor where only the past could pass through. "I was 12 years old. The premiere was for Indiana Jones, the one everyone was talking about. We didn't have much money, but I had been saving for weeks, odd jobs, shoveling snow, anything I could find. I had almost enough for a ticket, almost. I was 50 cents short." He held his thumb and forefinger close together, the gap barely visible, just that much. His eyes shifted, not really looking at Harrison now, but at something much further away. "The cashier wouldn't let me in. Rules are rules," she said, "so I waited outside." His words drew a picture without needing to ask for it, the sidewalk slick with patches of frozen slush, the glow of the marquee spilling across the pavement in fractured light, each bulb blinking against the cold. The air carried the smell of buttered popcorn every time the doors swung open, only for the scent to vanish again as they closed. "I stood there for 6 hours," he went on. "No gloves. The wind came down the street and curled up my sleeves like it was looking for somewhere to live. My breath hung in the air, and I counted the minutes by how many times my toes went numb and came back again." Around them, the cabin seemed to lean in. Passengers caught between the present and the scene he was building. When the movie ended, the crowd came out like a wave, people laughing, talking, shouting over each other. "And then I saw you." The captain's voice thinned for a moment, as if the memory itself was too cold to hold for long. "You were surrounded, security, publicists, cameras, everyone reaching for you. I was small. I got pushed back. I kept saying your name, not loud, not rude, just enough, I thought, for you to hear. You didn't." His jaw worked, but no words came out for a moment. "You got into the car and that was it." He stopped there, drawing a slow breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep, his hand lifting to the brim of his cap like he was steadying himself in turbulence. For a moment he was back in the present, standing in the aisle with every eye on him. Then he dropped his gaze, exhaled, and stepped back into the memory. "I walked home that night with my face stinging from the wind. Angry at the cashier for the 50 cents, angry at the crowd for being in the way, angry at myself for not shouting, angry at you for not seeing me. And when I woke up the next morning, the anger was still there. It stayed. It became a kind of fuel. The image of the boy sharpened with each sentence, a too-thin jacket zipped up to his chin, hands jammed into pockets that offered no real warmth, eyes fixed on the doors every time they opened. I told myself I'd never be invisible again, that I'd work hard enough, get far enough, to be the one who decided when things moved and when they didn't. His eyes lifted, scanning the cabin, and for a second he looked like he was measuring the distance between that boy and the man he'd become. I became a pilot. I learned to control the air, the schedule, the route, but I kept that night with me, not because it was the worst thing that ever happened to me, but because it was the moment I decided you weren't the man I thought you were. His voice had no heat now, just the weight of something carried too long. And I promised myself that if I ever saw you again, I'd make sure you knew what it felt like to be ignored. The hum of the engines filled the pause that followed, the only sound in the cabin. The captain's hand dropped from his cap to his side, fingers curling loosely as if letting go of the picture he had just painted. No one spoke. Even the ones holding phones seemed to have forgotten to keep filming. Outside, the sky beyond the windows had darkened into deep violet, the runway lights winking in their ordered sequence. Inside, the line between past and present felt paper-thin, as though the boy in the cold and the man in the uniform were standing in the same place at the same time. And now, so was Harrison Ford. The cabin was holding its breath, every face turned toward Harrison Ford, waiting to see whether he would deflect, deny, or fire back. He didn't do any of those things. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his forearms resting on his knees, and spoke in a tone that was calm enough to make the silence feel deliberate. "Are you sure I even saw you that night?" The captain's eyes flickered just once. Ford's voice stayed even. "People think you see everything in a crowd. The truth is you don't. The lights are bright, Your head is pulled in 6 different directions. You're trying to sign something here, answer a question there, get to where you're supposed to be. You look at one face and you miss 3 others, not because you don't care, because you're human. His gaze stayed steady on the captain, not challenging, not apologizing yet, just offering the reality of what those moments are like. I've had 100 nights like that, he went on. And I can tell you, each one has faces I still wish I'd seen. He reached into the inside pocket of his leather jacket and drew out a slim black pen. The motion was unhurried, as though he were reaching for nothing more than a note to jot down. Then he nodded toward the captain's hat, still resting on the hook beside the cockpit curtain. Without asking, he rose slightly in his seat, lifted it from its place, and balanced it in his palm. The cabin seemed to tilt toward him as he held it, his thumb brushing the inside lining where the fabric met the band. He clicked the pen once, the sound small but sharp in the quiet, and began to write in neat, deliberate strokes along the inner seam. No flourish, no rushed scrawl, just words placed with care. If I had seen you that night, it would have been different. I'm sorry I didn't. Beneath it, he signed his name in the same measured hand, the letters curving to fit the shape of the hat so they would never print through to the outside. When he was done, he closed the pen, slipped it back into his pocket, and replaced the hat on the hook exactly as he had found it. Then he sat back, his voice carrying just enough for the captain to hear. Now it's yours to keep or throw away. A few passengers shifted in their seats, glancing at each other as if unsure whether they had just witnessed a concession, a gesture, or something in between. The captain's eyes had dropped to the hat, but he didn't reach for it. Ford didn't press him. He settled into his seat again, folding his hands loosely in his lap, and looked out the window at the deepening night. There was no self-defense in the gesture, no attempt to reclaim pride, only a quiet acknowledgement that, whether or not he had been at fault, he was willing to meet the wound where it began. It was not the answer most of the cabin had expected, and perhaps that was why it landed so heavily. It didn't end the moment, it shifted it. And in the charged space between 2 men, one holding a memory, the other holding out an apology, there was, for the first time since the captain had stepped into the aisle, a sense that the next move might not be about anger at all. The captain's hand lifted almost unconsciously toward the hat. His fingertips brushed the brim first, then found their way inside, tracing the curve where the ink now lived against the lining. His eyes stayed on it for a long moment, as if the words themselves were heavier than the fabric could hold. When he looked up again, something in his face had shifted. I carried that night for a long time, he said, his voice quieter now, but clear enough to reach the far rows. It made me work harder, aim higher. It gave me a reason to keep going when nothing else did. His gaze drifted briefly toward the window, where the lights of the runway pulsed in their sequence. But it also made me smaller. It kept me locked in one version of the story, one where I was just a kid no one noticed, and you were the man who didn't see me. He stopped there, the words settling between them. In the pause, his eyes searched Harrison's face. Not for an argument, but for something harder to define, maybe permission to set it down. The silence stretched long enough for a few passengers to shift in their seats, the air still taut but no longer braced for impact. The captain's jaw tightened once, then eased. His eyes lowered again to the hat in his hand. There was a flicker there, a moment where it seemed he might set it back on the hook, retreat behind the uniform and the authority it gave him. Then his fingers tightened around the brim instead. He took in a slow breath, lifted his chin, and met Harrison's eyes squarely. "We'll fly," he said. The words were simple, but the tone was different now, no longer a verdict, but a decision. The tension that had been holding the cabin in suspension didn't vanish all at once, but it began to uncoil, like a rope loosening after being pulled too tight for too long. A flight attendant near the galley glanced toward the cockpit, already anticipating the sequence of motions that would follow. The captain didn't turn back immediately. He stood there a moment longer, hat still in hand, the weight of his own story lighter than it had been minutes ago. "I think," he added, "I've been holding on to the wrong part of that night." He didn't elaborate, and he didn't need to. Then he stepped past Harrison's row, the faint scent of jet fuel drifting in from the open service door, and disappeared back into the cockpit. The curtain fell into place behind him, and the cabin seemed to exhale as one. Harrison shifted in his seat, the faintest trace of a nod given to no one in particular, his gaze returning to the dark glass beside him. Outside, the runway lights kept their rhythm, and somewhere in the front of the plane, the captain was running through his pre-flight checks, not just for the aircraft, but for the part of himself he had finally chosen to let go. The cabin began to settle back into its rhythm. the low murmur of conversation returning in cautious increments, the clink of glassware, and the soft rustle of newspapers filling in the space where tension had been. The overhead lights had been dimmed to a warmer glow, casting a calm, even light across the rows. From the galley, a young flight attendant approached Harrison's seat, moving with the careful grace of someone carrying something that mattered. She set down a porcelain cup on his tray, steam curling from the surface of the pale green tea within. "Compliments of the captain," she said quietly, almost as if it were a message meant for him alone. Harrison inclined his head in acknowledgement, his eyes meeting hers for a second longer than necessary, then turned to the window as she moved away. He lifted the cup, feeling the gentle heat seep into his fingers. Outside, the wings stretched into the dark, a scatter of ground lights drifting slowly beneath them as the aircraft climbed into smooth air. He took a sip, the flavor sharp and clean, and for a moment the present softened into a memory. Years ago, he had been in the left seat of his own aircraft, flying over a stretch of rugged terrain in Wyoming. The sun had been low then too, casting long shadows over snow-packed fields. He had been on his way to a friend's ranch when, in the corner of his eye, he caught something, 3 flashes, irregular but deliberate. He banked slightly, bringing the patch of ground into view, and there it was again, an SOS laid out in dark stones against the snow. A small party of hikers had been stranded after their truck broke down, their footprints fading into the whiteness. No one else had reported it. No one else had been looking at that exact moment from that exact angle. He had circled back, landed on a makeshift strip, and loaded them into the plane himself. He could still remember the look in their eyes when they realized someone had seen them. The memory dissolved, and he was back in the quiet hum of the cabin, the tea cooling slightly in his hand. He thought of the captain's story, of the boy on the sidewalk whose face he'd never noticed. Sometimes you see, sometimes you don't. The difference, he knew, was often measured in moments no one could predict. He took another sip, watching the faint reflection of his own face in the glass, superimposed over the dark sky and distant constellations. Somewhere ahead, the flight path arced toward Tokyo, invisible yet precise. He set the cup back on the saucer, the motion unhurried, and let his gaze follow the horizon line until it blurred into the night. The hum of the engines was steady, their vibration a low, constant reminder that they were moving forward, leaving both the runway and the confrontation far behind. And yet, he knew, some things stayed with you even after the air smoothed out. The landing was smooth, the kind that barely registered in the body, just a subtle shift as the wheels kissed the wet runway. Outside, rain streaked the windows in silver threads, bending the airport lights into blurred halos. The engines eased back, the flaps adjusted, and the aircraft rolled toward the gate with the steady patience of a long journey ending. Inside, the cabin lights brightened slightly, the announcement chime sounded, and the quiet rustle of passengers gathering their things began. Harrison Ford remained seated until the aisle cleared enough to move without rush. When he stepped forward, carry-on in hand, the captain was waiting at the open cockpit door. The brim of his cap was set at its precise angle, the rest of his posture measured, but there was no formality in his eyes now. He extended his hand. "You're the calmest man I've ever seen in the air," he said, his voice pitched low enough that it stayed between them. Harrison took the handshake, firm and even. "Keeping your head cool isn't natural," he replied. "It's practice." The captain's mouth twitched as if considering a reply, but instead he gave a single nod, a silent acknowledgement. As Harrison stepped past, the captain turned slightly toward the next passenger, but his hand drifted up without thought, fingertips brushing the inside of his cap where the ink lay hidden against the lining. It was a brief touch, the kind people make when they're not checking for something, but confirming it's still there. Harrison walked down the jet bridge into the cool Tokyo air, the scent of rain carrying the faint tang of jet fuel. Cameras flashed somewhere beyond the terminal doors, but he didn't slow, his stride unhurried, his focus forward. This wasn't a story he would tell, and it wasn't one the captain would either. It would live in the quiet space between them, in the memory of a flight that almost didn't happen. Somewhere behind him, the captain was back in his seat, the signed message pressed against his forehead for the briefest second before the checklist claimed his hands again. In the cabin, passengers were filing out, some exchanging glances that said they had witnessed something without fully naming it. On the tarmac, the rain kept falling, steady and unbothered, washing over metal and glass alike. And somewhere in the layers of that night, 2 versions of a story, one carried for decades, the other only discovered hours ago, had met, acknowledged each other, and gone their separate ways lighter than they had arrived. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.